When most people think about serial killers, the same names come to mind: Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy. These are the monsters that dominate documentaries and true crime podcasts. But what about the ones who slipped through the cracks of public memory? The killers whose crimes were so disturbing, so methodical, so utterly evil that even seasoned investigators struggled to process what they were seeing. These are the predators who operated in the shadows, who turned murder into ritual, who destroyed lives while the world looked the other way. Tonight, we're diving into the darkest corners of criminal history to examine 5 serial killers you've probably never heard of. Their stories aren't just tales of violence, they're windows into the absolute worst of human nature. And by the time we're finished, you'll understand why some monsters are too terrifying for mainstream media to touch. Our first case takes us to the windswept moors of northern England in the 1960s, where 2 lovers embarked on a killing spree that would traumatize an entire nation. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley didn't just murder children, they tortured them, recorded their screams, and buried their bodies in shallow graves across the desolate landscape. What makes their story even more chilling is how ordinary they appeared. Brady worked as a stock clerk, Hindley was a typist. To their neighbors, they were just another quiet couple. But behind closed doors, they were planning something unthinkable. Brady was obsessed with Nazi ideology and the writings of the Marquis de Sade, the French author whose name gave us the word sadism. He read Mein Kampf, studied books about Nazi atrocities, and slowly began to see himself as above conventional morality. When he met Hindley at work, he found the perfect accomplice. She was infatuated with him, willing to do anything to keep his attention, and what Brady wanted was to kill. Their first victim was 16-year-old Pauline Reed. On July the 12th, 1963, Hindley approached Pauline as she walked to a dance. They knew each other from the neighborhood, so when Hindley asked if she wanted a ride to search for a lost glove on the moors, Pauline didn't hesitate. She got in the car with Hindley and Brady, and she was never seen alive again. They drove her to Saddleworth Moor, where Brady raped her, beat her with a shovel, and slashed her throat so deeply she was nearly decapitated. But Pauline was just the beginning. Over the next 2 years, 4 more children would disappear. 12-year-old John Kilbride was lured away from a market with promises of carrying bags for money. 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey was taken from a fairground. 17-year-old Edward Evans was picked up at a railway station. Each time, the method was the same. Hindley would gain their trust while Brady waited in the shadows. Then they would drive to the moors, and the nightmare would begin. What sets the Moors murderers apart from other killers isn't just the brutality of their crimes. It's the evidence they left behind. When police finally searched their house, they found photographs of the victims and a tape recording that would haunt everyone who heard it. The tape captured the final moments of 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey's life. You can hear her pleading, crying, begging Brady and Hindley to let her go home to her mother. Their voices are calm, almost bored, as they tell her to put her clothes on and pose for photographs. The tape was played in court during their trial, and grown men wept openly. Hardened police officers had to leave the room. It wasn't just evidence of murder. It was proof of something far worse: the complete absence of human empathy. Brady and Hindley didn't just kill these children, they savored their terror. They turned their final moments into entertainment. Brady was partially inspired by his fascination with Nazi philosophy, but his motives went deeper than ideology. He later told psychiatrists that he felt superior to other people, that conventional morality didn't apply to him. Hindley claimed she was under his influence, that she only participated because she loved him. But the evidence suggests otherwise. In many cases, she was the one who approached the victims. She was the friendly face that made children feel safe. She was an active participant, not a reluctant accomplice. Their reign of terror ended when they made a crucial mistake. They decided to involve Hindley's brother-in-law, David Smith, in their activities. On October 6, 1965, they invited Smith to their house and showed him how they killed. Brady attacked 17-year-old Edward Evans with an axe while Smith watched in horror. They expected him to join them. Instead, he went straight to the police. During the investigation, police found a notebook with John Kilbride's name written inside, along with photographs of Hindley standing on what would later be identified as his grave. The couple had been returning to the burial sites, posing for pictures with their victims' remains just feet below the surface. It was a level of callousness that shocked even experienced detectives. Brady and Hindley were both sentenced to life imprisonment, with the judge declaring they were too dangerous ever to be released. Brady eventually confessed to additional murders, but one victim, 12-year-old Keith Bennett, has never been found. His body remains somewhere on Saddleworth Moor, despite decades of searches. Even in death, the Moor's murderers continue to torment the families of their victims. What makes their case particularly disturbing is how they normalized the unthinkable. They treated murder like a hobby, something to plan and anticipate and remember fondly. They took photographs, made recordings, and returned to the graves because the killing itself wasn't enough. They needed to relive it, to possess their victims even after death. They transformed children into objects, reduced human lives to momentary entertainment. The Moor's murders revealed something terrifying about human nature. Not just the capacity for evil, but the ability to find joy in causing pain. Brady and Hindley didn't kill in rage or desperation. They killed because they enjoyed it. And that enjoyment, captured forever on tape and in photographs, remains one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in criminal history. Their story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the quiet couple next door, the ones who keep to themselves and never cause trouble. The cold rain hammered against the windows of Grantham Hospital on a February night in 1991. Inside, the pediatric ward hummed with the usual late-shift quiet. Nurses padded softly between rooms, checking on sleeping children. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. But lurking in those sterile corridors was something that defied comprehension. A predator who wore scrubs instead of a mask. A killer who smiled while administering poison instead of medicine. Her name was Beverly Allitt. To parents, she was the caring nurse who stayed late to comfort their sick children. To her colleagues, she was the dedicated professional who always seemed to be around when emergencies struck. But to the 13 children who crossed her path during those horrific 59 days, she was death itself, disguised as salvation. Beverly Gale Allitt was born on October 4, 1968, in the small village of Corby Glen near Grantham. From the outside, her childhood looked ordinary enough. Her father worked in an off-license shop. Her mother cleaned schools. She had two sisters and a brother. They lived in a modest home in a quiet English village where everyone knew everyone else's business. But even then, something was wrong. As a child, Beverly displayed behavior that should have been warning signs. She would volunteer eagerly for babysitting jobs, always seeking opportunities to be around children. At school, she was known for having an exceptionally high absence rate, constantly claiming illness after illness. Her teachers noted that she seemed to thrive on attention, particularly the kind that came from being sick or injured. When Beverly left school at 16, she enrolled in a nursing course at Grantham College. Even there, the red flags continued to wave. During her training at a local nursing home, staff discovered that someone had been smearing feces on the walls. Beverly was suspected, but nothing was ever proven. Her attendance record remained abysmal, with a seemingly endless string of mysterious ailments keeping her away from classes. Her personal relationships were equally troubled. A boyfriend from that time would later describe her as aggressive, manipulative, and deeply deceptive. She claimed false pregnancies to gain sympathy. She fabricated stories of being raped. She would disappear for days without explanation, then return with elaborate tales of trauma and victimization. Despite this disturbing history, despite her poor attendance and repeated failures in her nursing examinations, Beverly Allitt was hired by Grantham and Kesteven Hospital in early 1991. The pediatric ward was chronically understaffed, and administrators were desperate for bodies to fill shifts. They overlooked the warning signs, the red flags, the clear indicators that this woman should never have been allowed near vulnerable patients. It was a decision that would cost children their lives. Beverly's first victim was 7-week-old Liam Taylor. On February 21, 1991, Liam was admitted to the ward with a chest infection. It should have been routine treatment for a common childhood ailment. Instead, within hours of Beverly's shift beginning, the infant went into cardiac arrest. The medical team fought desperately to save him, but Liam died that night. The cause was listed as sudden infant death syndrome. No one suspected murder. Why would they? Beverly had been the nurse who raised the alarm, who had discovered the baby in distress, who had fought alongside the doctors to try to save him. She even comforted the grieving parents, holding their hands as they said goodbye to their son. But that first kill had awakened something monstrous in Beverly Allitt. The power she felt, the control over life and death, the attention she received as the nurse who had tried so hard to save the child. It was intoxicating. She wanted more. 11-year-old Timothy Hardwick was next. He had been admitted for epilepsy treatment, a routine procedure that should have been straightforward. But during Beverly's shift, Timothy suffered an unexplained hypoglycemic episode. His blood sugar levels plummeted to dangerous levels, sending him into a coma. Beverly was, once again, the nurse who discovered him in distress and raised the alarm. Timothy survived, but the damage was done. The massive insulin overdose that Beverly had secretly administered left him with permanent brain damage. He would never be the same child who had walked into that hospital. The attacks continued with terrifying frequency. Kaylee Desmond, just 15 months old, suffered mysterious breathing difficulties during Beverly's shift. Paul Crampton, 5 months old, went into cardiac arrest while under her care. Both children survived, but both bore the invisible scars of Beverly's attempts to murder them. Then came Becky Phillips. She was just 2 months old when she was admitted to the ward for gastroenteritis. Her condition was improving, her parents were hopeful, and discharge was planned for the following day. But on April 22, 1991, during Beverly's night shift, baby Becky suffered a massive heart attack. Beverly was the one who found her. Beverly was the one who called for help. Beverly was the one who stood by as the medical team fought to save the infant's life. And Beverly was the one who had injected a massive dose of potassium chloride directly into Becky's intravenous line, stopping her tiny heart in its tracks. Becky Phillips died that night, and something finally clicked for the medical staff. Dr. Nelson Porter, the consultant pediatrician, began to notice a disturbing pattern. All of these emergencies, all of these unexplained cardiac arrests and breathing difficulties, they were happening during Beverly Allitt's shifts. The statistical probability of one nurse being present for so many medical emergencies was virtually impossible. But Beverly was clever. She had studied the symptoms, learned the drug dosages, understood exactly how to inflict maximum damage while appearing to be the dedicated caregiver. She would inject children with insulin, causing their blood sugar to crash. She would administer potassium chloride, stopping their hearts. She would inject air bubbles into their bloodstreams, creating fatal embolisms. Most sinister of all, she seemed to target the most vulnerable patients, premature babies, children with existing medical conditions, infants whose parents were too distraught to ask difficult questions. She preyed on families at their most desperate moments, offering comfort while simultaneously destroying their worlds. The investigation began quietly. Hospital administrators couldn't believe that one of their own nurses might be murdering patients, but the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Police were called in, and they began the painstaking process of reviewing every case, every shift, every unexplained emergency. What they discovered was a pattern of horror that defied comprehension. Beverly Allitt had been systematically attacking children for nearly 2 months. Some she had tried to kill, others she had tortured with near-fatal doses of drugs before rescuing them. The method varied, but the result was always the same. Beverly positioned herself as the hero, the caring nurse who had done everything possible to save the child. On May 28, 1991, Beverly Allitt was arrested. Even then, she maintained her innocence, claiming that she was being scapegoated for the hospital's failures. She suggested that the ward might be cursed, that perhaps the building itself was somehow causing these mysterious illnesses. The trial began in February 1993, and the evidence presented was devastating. Forensic experts testified about the insulin found in victims' blood, the potassium chloride detected in their tissues, the air bubbles discovered during autopsies. Medical experts explained how Beverly had used her knowledge of pediatric medicine to inflict maximum suffering while appearing to provide care. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from Beverly herself. Under questioning, she displayed a complete lack of empathy for her victims. She showed no remorse for the children she had killed, no sympathy for the families she had destroyed. Instead, she seemed almost proud of her ability to manipulate the medical system. Psychiatrists who examined Beverly diagnosed her with Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition where caregivers deliberately harm those under their care to gain attention and sympathy. Professor Roy Meadow, the pediatric expert who testified at her trial, explained how Beverly demonstrated all the classic symptoms of this disorder. She craved attention, particularly the kind that came from being involved in medical emergencies. She thrived on the drama, the chaos, the moment when she could step forward as the dedicated professional trying to save a child's life. The fact that she was the one who had caused the emergency in the first place was irrelevant to her. What mattered was the attention, the sympathy, the brief moment when she was the center of everyone's universe. On May 28, 1993, exactly 2 years after her arrest, Beverly Allitt was sentenced to 13 life sentences. Justice Latham told her that she was a serious danger to others and would likely never be considered safe enough for release. The judge's words echoed through the courtroom as Beverly showed no emotion, no recognition of the magnitude of her crimes. She was sent to Rampton Secure Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility where she remains to this day. Over the years, she has made several attempts to be transferred to a mainstream prison, claiming that she no longer poses a threat. Each application has been denied. In 2023, her latest request for transfer was rejected, and she won't be eligible for another assessment until 2026 at the earliest. The families of Beverly's victims have never forgotten. They carry the scars of her crimes every day, knowing that the person they trusted to care for their children had instead tried to kill them. Some of the survivors still bear the physical and mental effects of her attacks. Others died never knowing that their final moments were caused not by illness, but by the deliberate actions of someone who had sworn to do no harm. Beverly Allitt represents something uniquely terrifying in the world of serial killers. She didn't stalk dark alleys or break into homes. She didn't need to hunt for victims or worry about getting caught in the act. Instead, she was invited into the most vulnerable moments of people's lives, trusted with their most precious possessions, and given the tools and opportunity to destroy them. She wore the uniform of a healer while harboring the soul of a killer. She spoke words of comfort while administering poison. She offered hope while delivering despair. In a place where parents brought their sick children expecting healing, Beverly Allitt brought only death disguised as medicine. The most chilling aspect of her crimes isn't just what she did, but how easily she did it. For 59 days, she moved through that hospital ward like a shadow, selecting victims, administering fatal doses of drugs, and then seamlessly transitioning into the role of the concerned caregiver. She fooled doctors, nurses, administrators, and devastated parents. She turned the sanctuary of a children's hospital into her personal hunting ground. And the truly terrifying reality is that if Dr. Porter hadn't finally noticed the pattern, if the investigation hadn't been launched, Beverly Allitt might still be out there. She might still be working in healthcare, still be trusted with vulnerable patients, still be using her position to satisfy her twisted need for attention and control. Beverly Allitt didn't just kill children. She murdered trust itself, leaving behind a legacy of suspicion and fear that haunts the medical profession to this day. She proved that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it comes disguised as care, wearing scrubs instead of a mask, carrying a syringe instead of a weapon. In the sterile corridors of Grantham Hospital, Beverly Allitt became something far more terrifying than any fictional monster. Now let's dive into two more killers who've remained hidden in the shadows of criminal history, each representing a different kind of terror that most people have never encountered. Gerald Thomas Archer operated in what was once considered the serial killer capital of the world, London, Ontario, in the late 1960s. But Archer wasn't your typical predator, stalking random victims on dark streets. He had a specific type, a particular vulnerability he exploited with chilling precision. Archer targeted middle-aged chambermaids, women who worked alone in hotels and boarding houses, women who were invisible to most of society. Born in London, Ontario in 1932, Archer's early life already showed the warning signs that authorities would later wish they'd recognized. By 1950, he had accumulated a criminal record that read like a textbook progression of escalating antisocial behavior: robbery, breaking and entering, possession charges. These weren't crimes of desperation or poverty. They were the experimental phases of someone learning how to take what he wanted from a world he believed owed him everything. What made Archer particularly dangerous was his patience and his method. He didn't strike randomly or in fits of rage. Instead, he studied his environment, identified the perfect victims, and struck when they were most vulnerable. Middle-aged chambermaids represented everything Archer found appealing in a target. They worked alone during quiet shifts, often in isolated areas of hotels and boarding houses. They came from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, meaning their disappearances might not immediately trigger intensive investigations. Most importantly, they were women who society had trained to be helpful, to trust, to not immediately suspect danger from a man who seemed harmless. Archer's modus operandi was almost surgical in its precision. He would gain access to hotels and boarding houses during the quieter periods when these women would be cleaning rooms or performing maintenance duties in isolation. He knew their schedules, their routines, their moments of greatest vulnerability. When he struck, it was swift and brutal, leaving behind crime scenes that spoke to a level of violence that went far beyond simple robbery or assault. The investigation into Archer's crimes reveals just how easily a predator can slip through the cracks of society when their victims are people the system doesn't prioritize. For years, the deaths and disappearances of these working women were treated as isolated incidents, random crimes in a rough part of town. The pattern only became clear when investigators finally connected the dots between multiple crime scenes, realizing they were dealing with someone who had been hunting systematically for months. When Archer was finally picked up for questioning over the death of Belva Russell on February 12, 1971, the facade of normalcy crumbled quickly. Fingerprints and a police lineup sealed his fate, but what happened in the courtroom revealed the true nature of the man behind the crimes. When the 12-man jury returned with a verdict of guilty and Archer was sentenced to life imprisonment, his response was chilling. "That's only the first strike against me." That statement wasn't just bravado, it was a promise. Even behind bars, Archer continued to torment those around him with the knowledge that his crimes extended far beyond what he'd been convicted for. He was paroled in 1985, becoming a drifter who disappeared into the margins of society until his death from a heart attack in 1995. His body went unclaimed, buried in a potter's field like the forgotten victims he had once stalked. But death didn't end Archer's story. Sometimes, the most damning evidence comes from the people closest to the killer. After his death, both his estranged wife and daughter came forward with information that sent chills through the investigators who had worked his cases. They revealed that Archer had once drunkenly confessed to them that he had killed Edith Autier, a murder that had never been connected to him during his lifetime. The advancement of forensic technology in the late 1990s gave investigators tools that hadn't existed during Archer's active years. Authorities exhumed his remains in February 2000 to procure DNA samples, and the results confirmed what his family members had suspected for years. DNA extracted from cigarette butts found near Jane Woolley's body matched Archer's genetic profile perfectly. This revelation opened up a horrifying possibility. How many other cold cases could be attributed to Gerald Thomas Archer? How many other middle-aged women had died at his hands during those years when he moved freely through London, Ontario? The fact that his own family members harbored suspicions about his violent nature for years raises disturbing questions about the signs that might have been missed, the warnings that went unheeded. Archer's case represents a particular kind of evil that targets the most vulnerable members of society. These weren't random killings or crimes of passion. They were calculated attacks on women who were simply trying to make an honest living, women who were working to support themselves or their families. The tragedy is compounded by the reality that these victims were often overlooked by both the media and law enforcement, their deaths treated as less significant because of their social status. Now we turn to Russell Johnson, known as the Bedroom Strangler, a man whose crimes terrorized Canada in the 1970s and whose name still sends chills through the families of his victims. Born in 1947, Johnson represents a different kind of predator, one whose violence was more personal, more intimate, and somehow more terrifying because of the calculated nature of his attacks. Johnson's killing spree in London and Guelph during the 1970s wasn't characterized by the random violence that marks many serial killers. Instead, his crimes showed a level of planning and psychological manipulation that made him particularly dangerous. He didn't just kill, he created elaborate scenarios that maximized both his control and his victims' terror. The investigation surrounding Johnson's crimes became the costliest in Ontario's history, racking up expenses that reflected both the complexity of his methods and the dedication required to finally bring him to justice. But the financial cost paled in comparison to the human cost, the lives destroyed, and the families left to grapple with losses that defied comprehension. Johnson's first known victim was Diane Bites, a 23-year-old woman whose body was discovered on New Year's Eve, 1974, by her boyfriend James Britton. The scene that greeted Britton was one of calculated cruelty. Bites had been strangled with her own brassiere, her hands tied behind her back with a nylon stocking. The positioning of her body and the evidence at the scene suggested that Johnson had taken his time, that the murder wasn't a crime of passion, but a carefully orchestrated act of violence. What made the scene even more disturbing was the evidence that Bites had been sexually assaulted after death. This wasn't just murder, it was necrophilia, a level of depravity that spoke to Johnson's complete disconnection from normal human empathy. The Guelph police offered a $5,000 reward for information leading to the killer's capture, desperately searching for clues that might lead them to a dark-colored four-door Buick automobile that had been seen parked behind the apartment building in the early morning hours. The connection between Johnson and Bites wasn't random. At the time of her murder, Johnson was visiting his father in Guelph and knew of Bites because his ex-wife used to live in the same apartment building. This personal connection suggests that Johnson's crimes weren't entirely opportunistic. He was targeting people within his extended social circle, using his knowledge of their routines and vulnerabilities to plan his attacks. Johnson's second known victim was Donna Veldboom, a 22-year-old woman who lived in the apartment above Johnson's own residence. On July 16, 1977, Veldboom was strangled to death in what marked an escalation in Johnson's methods. This was his first stabbing, indicating that his violence was becoming more intense, more personal. But what happened after the murder revealed another disturbing aspect of Johnson's psychology. His obsessive-compulsive tendencies compelled him to clean Veldboom's body, tuck her into bed, and wash the bloody linens. This wasn't just an attempt to cover up evidence. It was a ritual that satisfied some twisted psychological need. Johnson was creating a tableau, staging the scene according to his own warped sense of order and control. When Johnson was finally arrested in July 1977, the revelations that emerged during his interrogation were staggering. He was charged with murdering 3 women, Bites, George, and Veldboom. But according to Police Inspector Robert Young, Johnson's confessions went far beyond these 3 cases. Johnson had voluntarily admitted himself to the London Psychiatric Hospital in 1969 and had been diagnosed as a sexual deviant, but he claimed that he wouldn't have killed if he had received proper medical treatment. At trial, Johnson's defense centered on his claim of having an uncontrollable urge to rape and kill. But what shocked everyone present was Johnson's additional admission. He confessed to perpetrating 4 other homicides and 11 non-fatal assaults. The scope of his crimes was far beyond what investigators had initially suspected. Johnson is currently locked up at a maximum security mental hospital in Penetanguishene, Ontario, where he remains at age 62. Every year, he applies for more lenient conditions at his facility, applications that the family members of his victims strenuously object to. He has been chemically castrated and takes Lupron to reduce his testosterone, measures that reflect both the ongoing danger he represents and the system's acknowledgement that his urges remain active even decades after his arrest. The case took another turn in 2012 when the Ontario Court of Appeals rejected Johnson's plea to be moved to the Brockville Mental Health Center. The decision reflected the ongoing concern that Johnson, despite years of treatment and chemical intervention, remains a significant threat to public safety. What makes Johnson's case particularly disturbing is the combination of calculated planning and psychological dysfunction that characterized his crimes. He wasn't killing in moments of rage or passion. He was methodically hunting victims, using his knowledge of their routines and his position within their social circles to plan attacks that maximized his control and their vulnerability. The lasting impact of Johnson's crimes extends far beyond the immediate victims and their families. His case represents a failure of the mental health system to adequately address dangerous individuals before they escalate to murder. Johnson had been diagnosed as a sexual deviant and had voluntarily sought treatment, but the system failed to provide the intensive intervention that might have prevented his killing spree. Both Gerald Thomas Archer and Russell Johnson represent a particular kind of evil that operates within the margins of society, targeting vulnerable individuals who are often overlooked by both law enforcement and the media. Their crimes remind us that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most ordinary, who blend into their communities while harboring dark fantasies that eventually erupt into horrific violence. The advancement of forensic science has allowed investigators to solve cold cases and connect crimes that might never have been linked during the active years of these killers. But for the families of their victims, justice delayed is justice denied, and the pain of loss remains as sharp today as it was when these crimes were first committed. These cases also highlight the importance of taking seriously the reports and concerns of family members who suspect that their loved ones might be capable of violence. Now let's dive deeper into the horrifying reality of those who hide their true nature behind the most innocent facades. Because sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't found lurking in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. They're sitting right next to you in a hospital room, offering comfort with one hand while preparing to kill with the other. Beverly Allitt seemed like everything you'd want in a children's nurse: compassionate, dedicated, always volunteering for extra shifts. But beneath that caring exterior was something far more sinister, something that turned one of Britain's most trusted professions into a hunting ground for the most vulnerable victims imaginable. Beverly Gale Allitt was born on October 4th, 1968, in the small village of Corby Glen near Grantham. From the outside, her childhood looked normal enough. 2 sisters, a brother, a father who worked at an off-license, and a mother who cleaned at the local school. But even then, warning signs were flashing like neon lights that nobody bothered to read. She failed her entrance exam to the prestigious Kesteven and Grantham Girls' School, ending up at Charles Red Secondary Modern instead. But here's what's chilling. She was already volunteering for babysitting jobs, already positioning herself around children, while already learning how to gain the trust of parents who had no idea what they were inviting into their homes. At 16, she left school to pursue nursing at Grantham College, and this is where the red flags turned into screaming sirens. During her training at a local nursing home, staff found feces smeared on walls. Her attendance record was abysmal, a string of mysterious illnesses keeping her away from work more often than not. Her boyfriend at the time would later describe her as aggressive, manipulative, and deceptive. She claimed false pregnancies, invented rape allegations, and seemed to live in a world where lies came easier than breathing. But here's the terrifying part. Despite failing her nursing examinations repeatedly, despite her history of bizarre behavior and poor attendance, the chronically understaffed Grantham and Kesteven Hospital gave her a temporary 6-month contract in 1991. They were so desperate for nurses that they ignored every warning sign, every red flag, every indication that something was fundamentally wrong with Beverly Allitt, and that decision would cost 4 children their lives. Ward 4 at Grantham Hospital was supposed to be a place of healing. Parents brought their sick children there, expecting expert care, hoping for recovery, trusting that the nurses watching over their little ones had their best interests at heart. Between February and April 1991, that trust was shattered in the most horrific way imaginable. The attacks began almost immediately after Allitt started working. Her method was as simple as it was deadly. She would inject massive doses of insulin into her victims or introduce air bubbles into their bloodstream, causing cardiac arrest. To the untrained eye, it looked like natural complications, tragic but not suspicious. But Allitt wasn't content with just killing. She wanted to play God, to have complete control over life and death. Her first victim was 7-week-old Liam Taylor. His parents had brought him in for a chest infection, a routine childhood illness that should have been easily treatable. Instead, Allitt administered a massive dose of insulin, sending the infant into cardiac arrest. Liam survived, but barely. His parents had no idea that the nurse who appeared so concerned, so caring, so devastated by his condition, was the same person who had tried to murder their child. But Liam's survival wasn't enough for Allitt. She needed more. She needed the rush of holding a life in her hands, the intoxicating power of deciding who lived and who died. 11-year-old Timothy Hardwick became her next target. She injected him with insulin, then stood by calmly as his body went into shock. He survived, but the experience left him with permanent brain damage. Then came the murders. 4-month-old Becky Phillips was admitted with gastroenteritis, a common childhood ailment that should have resolved with basic treatment. Instead, Allitt injected air into her bloodstream, causing a fatal embolism. She watched as the baby's heart stopped, as her tiny body went limp, as her parents' world collapsed around them. And through it all, Allitt maintained her facade of caring professionalism. 1-year-old Kaylee Desmond was next. Admitted for chest pains, she should have been home within days. Instead, Allitt administered insulin and potassium, causing multiple cardiac arrests. Somehow, miraculously, Kaylee survived, but the damage was done. Her parents watched their healthy toddler fighting for her life, never knowing that her nurse was the one pushing her toward death. Paul Crampton was just 5 months old when his parents brought him in for a minor chest infection. Allitt saw opportunity. She injected him with insulin, then calmly called for help when he went into cardiac arrest. She participated in the resuscitation efforts, playing the part of the concerned healthcare professional while knowing she was the cause of his suffering. Paul survived, but barely. Bradley Gibson was only 5 months old. His parents trusted the hospital, trusted the nurses, trusted that their baby was in safe hands. Allitt injected him with insulin, causing severe brain damage. He survived, but his life was forever altered by those few moments when a monster in nurse's clothing decided to play with his fate. Then came the killing spree that would finally expose her. Yik-Hung Chan was just 2 months old when his parents brought him in for gastroenteritis. Allitt injected him with insulin, causing fatal cardiac arrest. She stood by his bedside, comforting his parents as they watched their baby die, never revealing that she was the architect of their nightmare. 7-year-old Bradley Gibson became her next victim. Wait, let me correct that. 7-year-old Christopher Peasgood was brought in for an epileptic fit. Allitt saw an opportunity and administered insulin, causing cardiac arrest. Christopher survived, but the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Christopher King was just 2 months old when Allitt decided his life was hers to take. She injected him with insulin, then participated in the frantic efforts to save him. He died in her arms while she maintained her mask of professional concern. 15-month-old Claire Peck was brought in for asthma treatment, a routine visit that should have ended with her going home to her family. Instead, Allitt administered insulin, causing cardiac arrest. Claire died, and Allitt comforted her grieving parents, offering condolences while hiding the fact that she was responsible for their loss. Katie Phillips was just 5 months old, the twin sister of Becky Phillips, who had died earlier. Her parents, and the still grieving one daughter, brought Katie in for gastroenteritis. Allitt couldn't resist. She injected the infant with insulin, causing cardiac arrest. Katie died, and her parents lost their second child to the same monster who had taken their first. But it was the death of 15-month-old Claire Peck that finally triggered suspicion. Dr. Nelson Porter, a consultant pediatrician, noticed that an unusual number of children were suffering cardiac arrests on Ward 4. He started asking questions, looking at patterns, examining the timing of these mysterious medical emergencies. The investigation revealed a horrifying truth. Beverly Allitt was the only nurse on duty during every single attack, every cardiac arrest, every mysterious collapse, every unexplained death that had occurred while she was working. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. When police arrested her in 1991, Allitt maintained her innocence. She claimed to be devastated by the deaths, insisted that she had done everything possible to save the children. But the forensic evidence told a different story. Insulin levels in the victims' blood were impossibly high. Air bubbles were found in their systems. The method was clear, the perpetrator obvious. During her trial in 1993, the full extent of her crimes was revealed. She had attacked 13 children in just 59 days. 4 had died, 3 others had suffered permanent brain damage, and 6 more had been seriously harmed. The courtroom was silent as the prosecutor described how she had systematically targeted the most vulnerable patients, using her position of trust to commit unspeakable acts. The defense tried to argue that Allitt suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a psychological condition where caregivers deliberately harm those in their care to gain attention and sympathy. Professor Roy Meadow, a pediatrics expert, testified that Allitt would never be cured, making her a permanent danger to anyone who came into contact with her. But the jury wasn't interested in excuses. They saw through her facade, recognized the calculated nature of her crimes, understood that she had made a conscious choice to murder innocent children. On May 28, 1993, Beverly Allitt was convicted of 4 counts of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, and 6 counts of causing grievous bodily harm. Justice Latham sentenced her to 13 life sentences, stating that she was a serious danger to others and was unlikely ever to be considered safe enough for release. She was sent to Rampton Secure Hospital, where she remains to this day. But even behind bars, Allitt continued to manipulate and deceive. She developed anorexia, refusing to eat and requiring force feeding. She claimed to suffer from various illnesses, demanded special treatment, and continued to seek the attention and sympathy that had driven her to murder. In 2023, she applied for transfer to a mainstream prison, arguing that she no longer posed a threat. Her request was denied, and she won't be eligible for another assessment until 2026 at the earliest. The families of her victims have never recovered from their losses. Parents who trusted the healthcare system, who believed their children were safe in professional hands, discovered that the person they had relied on was actually a predator in disguise. Some children survived but live with permanent disabilities caused by Allitt's attacks. Others carry the psychological scars of trauma they don't even remember. Beverly Allitt represents one of the most terrifying types of killer, the trusted professional who uses their position to harm those they're supposed to protect. She didn't hunt strangers in dark alleys. She didn't break into homes or stalk victims through the night. Instead, she sat by hospital beds, smiled at worried parents, and systematically destroyed lives while wearing the uniform of a healer. Her case changed how British hospitals operate. New safeguards were put in place, better background checks implemented, and monitoring systems designed to catch unusual patterns of patient deaths or complications. But the damage was already done. 4 children were dead, families were destroyed, and the public's trust in healthcare professionals was shaken to its core. What makes Beverly Allitt so terrifying isn't just what she did, but how easily she did it. For 59 days, she moved through that hospital like a shadow of death, targeting the most innocent and defenseless victims imaginable. She looked parents in the eye as their children died from her actions. She comforted grieving families while knowing she was the cause of their pain. She participated in memorial services for children she had murdered. And through it all, she maintained the perfect facade: the caring nurse, the dedicated professional, the compassionate caregiver who just happened to be present during tragic circumstances. She was a master manipulator who understood that people see what they expect to see. Nobody suspected the smiling nurse because nobody wanted to believe that such evil could exist in a place dedicated to healing. Beverly Allitt proved that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the people we trust most, the professionals we rely on, the caregivers we entrust with our most precious possessions. Sometimes evil wears scrubs and carries a stethoscope. Sometimes it smiles while it kills, comforts while it destroys, and heals with one hand while murdering with the other. The angel of death wasn't an angel at all. Moving to our next case brings us face to face with someone who should have been the ultimate protector, but instead became the ultimate predator. Beverly Allitt operated within the sterile walls of a children's hospital, where trust wasn't just expected, it was essential. Parents brought their most precious possessions, their sick children, believing they were placing them in safe hands. What they didn't know was that those hands belonged to one of Britain's most calculated killers. Beverly Gale Allitt was born on October 4th, 1968, in the quiet village of Corby Glen, near Grantham. From the outside, she seemed like any other girl growing up in working-class England. Her father, Richard, worked in an off-license, her mother cleaned schools, and Beverly had 2 sisters and a brother. But even in childhood, there were signs that something wasn't quite right. She failed her entrance exam to the local grammar school and attended Charles Read Secondary Modern instead. Teachers noticed her eagerness to volunteer for babysitting jobs, which seemed sweet at the time. Looking back, it feels sinister. After leaving school at 16, Beverly enrolled in a nursing course at Grantham College. This is where the red flags started multiplying, but somehow everyone kept missing them. During her training at various nursing homes, she displayed bizarre behavior that should have ended her career before it began. She was caught smearing feces on walls, had an exceptionally high absence rate due to mysterious illnesses, and repeatedly failed her nursing examinations. Her boyfriend at the time later described her as aggressive, manipulative, and deceptive. She claimed false pregnancies and even fabricated rape allegations when relationships ended. Despite this alarming history, Beverly was somehow hired on a temporary 6-month contract at the chronically understaffed Grantham and Casteven Hospital in Lincolnshire in 1991. The hospital was desperate for nurses, and Beverly slipped through the cracks of a system that should have protected the most vulnerable patients of all, children. What happened next was 59 days of systematic terror that would shake Britain to its core. Between February and April 1991, Beverly Allitt murdered 4 infants, attempted to murder 3 others, and caused grievous bodily harm to 6 more children on the pediatric ward. But this wasn't random violence or crimes of passion. This was methodical, calculated evil disguised as compassion. Beverly's method was as chilling as it was effective. She administered large doses of insulin to at least 2 of her victims, causing their blood sugar to plummet to dangerous levels. In another case, investigators found that a large air bubble had been injected into a victim's bloodstream, causing a fatal embolism. She had access to the drugs. She knew exactly how much would cause harm without immediately raising suspicion, and most importantly, she was trusted completely by parents and colleagues alike. The children she targeted were already vulnerable, already sick, already fighting for their lives. 7-week-old Liam Taylor was her first victim, dying from what appeared to be a sudden cardiac arrest. 2-month-old Becky Phillips suffered multiple cardiac arrests before finally succumbing. Each death was tragic, but seemed explainable in a pediatric ward where sick children unfortunately sometimes don't recover. That's what made Beverly so dangerous. She hid her murders behind the natural tragedies that occur in hospitals every day. But Beverly wasn't just killing. She was playing an even more twisted game. Some children she would harm just enough to make them critically ill. Then she would be the one to discover their distress and raise the alarm. She positioned herself as the hero, the dedicated nurse who was always there when tragedy struck. Parents thanked her for her care and compassion. Colleagues praised her dedication. She was feeding off the attention, the drama, the power she held over life and death. The pattern became clear only in hindsight. Beverly was the only nurse on duty for every single attack. She had access to all the drugs used in the assaults. And there was something else, something that revealed the true depth of her psychological disturbance. Medical experts later determined that Beverly suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition where a caregiver deliberately causes harm to someone under their care to attract attention and sympathy to themselves. The end came when medical staff finally noticed the alarming number of cardiac arrests occurring on the children's ward. It was the death of Becky Phillips that triggered the investigation. Police were called in, and the horrifying truth began to emerge. Beverly had attacked 13 children in less than 2 months. 4 had died. The others bore the physical and psychological scars of her attacks. During her trial at Nottingham Crown Court in May 1993, the full extent of Beverly's crimes was laid bare. Expert testimony revealed how she had systematically exploited her position of trust to harm the most innocent victims imaginable. Professor Roy Meadow, a pediatrics expert, explained to the jury how Beverly demonstrated symptoms of both Munchausen syndrome and Munchausen syndrome by proxy. In his professional opinion, Beverly Allitt could never be cured, making her a permanent danger to anyone who might come under her care. Justice David Latham sentenced Beverly to 13 life sentences, telling her she was a serious danger to others and unlikely ever to be considered safe enough for release. She was sent to Rampton Secure Hospital in Nottinghamshire, where she remains to this day. In 2023, she appeared before a mental health tribunal seeking transfer to a mainstream prison, but authorities denied her request. She won't be eligible for another assessment until 2026 at the earliest. What makes Beverly Allitt's case so particularly disturbing isn't just the vulnerability of her victims or the betrayal of trust, though both are horrific enough. It's the realization that she operated successfully for nearly 2 months in plain sight, praised by colleagues and trusted by families, while systematically torturing and killing children. She turned healing into harm, care into cruelty, and trust into terror. The Beverly Allitt case forced a complete overhaul of how British hospitals monitor staff and investigate unusual patterns of patient deaths. But the deeper question remains unanswered. How do we protect ourselves from predators who don't lurk in shadows, but instead wear uniforms, carry credentials, and smile while they destroy lives? Now we come to the final killer on our list, and perhaps the most terrifying of all because of the sheer scale of his evil. Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos, known as La Bestia, the Beast, operated in Colombia during the 1990s and became the most prolific serial killer in recorded history. What makes Garavito so chilling isn't just the number of his victims, but how he systematically hunted the most vulnerable members of society, children who had been forgotten by the world. Between 1992 and 1999, Garavito murdered at least 400 children, though he was only convicted for 138 deaths. Think about that number for a moment. 400 children. These weren't random killings or crimes of passion. This was industrial-scale murder, carried out with the methodical precision of a predator who had turned a child killing into his life's work. Garavito was born in 1957 in Western Colombia into a world of violence and neglect. His father was an alcoholic who regularly beat him, and his mother showed him no affection whatsoever. But here's what's truly disturbing about Garavito's childhood. He didn't just suffer abuse, he learned from it. He studied how fear worked, how manipulation functioned, how to identify weakness in others. By the time he reached adulthood, he had become a master at spotting vulnerability. His victims were street children, homeless boys between the ages of 8 and 16 who roamed Colombian cities looking for food, work, or simply a safe place to sleep. These children were invisible to society, forgotten by families who couldn't care for them, ignored by authorities who saw them as problems rather than people. Garavito understood this perfectly. He knew that when these children disappeared, no one would come looking for them. His method was devastatingly effective. Garavito would approach these children in various disguises, most often dressed as a priest or monk, sometimes as a farmer or street vendor. He carried candy, small amounts of money, and promises of work or safety. To a hungry, desperate child living on the streets, Garavito must have seemed like salvation. He would smile, speak gently, offer food or a few coins, and slowly gain their trust. The children would follow him willingly, believing they were being rescued. Garavito would walk with them for hours, encouraging them to share their stories, learning about their lives, their fears, their dreams. This wasn't just manipulation, it was psychological torture. He was studying them, understanding exactly how to break them down completely. Once he had isolated his victims in remote areas, usually near the cities of Pereira or other locations across 54 Colombian towns, the horror would begin. Garavito would bind the children, torture them sexually, and then strangle them to death. But even death wasn't the end of his cruelty. He would mutilate their bodies, sometimes while they were still alive, and arrange them in grotesque displays. What makes Garavito's crimes even more disturbing is the geographic scope of his killing spree. He wasn't confined to one city or region. He traveled constantly across Colombia, leaving a trail of dead children in his wake. He was careful, methodical, and patient. He would spend weeks in a single location, identifying potential victims, learning the patterns of street children, and then striking when the moment was right. The discovery of his crimes began in 1997, when a mass grave containing the bodies of 36 boys was found near Pereira. The sight was so horrific that seasoned investigators struggled to process what they were seeing. Small bodies, brutally mutilated, bearing signs of torture and sexual assault, all arranged with the same methodical precision. This wasn't the work of a madman. This was the signature of someone who had perfected his technique through years of practice. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of Garavito's evil. As police connected disappearances across multiple cities and regions, a pattern emerged that was almost impossible to comprehend. Children were vanishing at an alarming rate wherever Garavito had been present. The timeline stretched back years, suggesting he had been killing almost continuously since the early 1990s. When Garavito was finally captured in 1999, he didn't deny his crimes. Instead, he confessed with a calm, matter-of-fact demeanor that chilled investigators. He described his murders in clinical detail, explaining his methods, his victim selection process, and his disposal techniques as if he were discussing a business operation. He showed no remorse, no emotion, no recognition that he had destroyed hundreds of lives and devastated countless families. During his confession, Garavito led police to burial sites across Colombia. He remembered exactly where he had dumped bodies, how he had killed each child, and specific details about his victims that only the killer could know. His memory was perfect, as if each murder had been carefully cataloged in his mind like entries in a twisted ledger. The legal proceedings that followed exposed the inadequacies of Colombia's justice system when dealing with crimes of this magnitude. Colombian law had no provision for someone who had committed hundreds of murders. The maximum sentence for any crime was roughly 22 years. And even with multiple convictions, the system wasn't designed to handle a serial killer of Garavito's scope. Ultimately, Garavito was sentenced to over 1,800 years in prison, but under Colombian law, he would have been eligible for parole after serving just 22 years due to his cooperation with authorities in locating victims' remains. The idea that the world's most prolific serial killer might someday walk free was a source of ongoing horror for the families of his victims and the Colombian public. But Garavito never got that chance. In October 2023, he died in prison from terminal cancer at the age of 66. He spent his final years in a maximum security facility, reportedly continuing to write about his crimes and maintaining the same cold, detached attitude that had characterized his confessions decades earlier. The true horror of Luis Garavito's story isn't just the number of children he killed, though that number is staggering beyond comprehension. It's the systematic nature of his crimes, the way he turned child murder into a routine, and the fact that he operated for years in plain sight. He walked through Colombian cities as a respected figure, a man dressed as a priest who appeared to be helping street children. Parents who saw him might have felt relief, thinking their children were being cared for by someone from the church. Garavito's case also exposes the tragic reality of how society treats its most vulnerable members. The children he targeted were already victims of poverty, abandonment, and neglect. They lived on the margins of society, invisible to most people, forgotten by systems that should have protected them. Garavito understood this perfectly and exploited it with devastating efficiency. Even today, the full extent of his crimes may never be known. He claimed to have killed over 400 children, but investigators believe the actual number could be even higher. Some bodies were never recovered, some disappearances were never reported, and some crimes may have occurred in remote areas where they were never discovered. What makes Luis Garavito's story so profoundly disturbing is that it represents evil on an almost incomprehensible scale. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of madness. This was systematic, methodical destruction of human life carried out over nearly a decade. He didn't just kill children, he erased them from existence, turning them into statistics in his personal catalog of horror. The legacy of La Bestia serves as a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. They can appear as helpers, as religious figures, as people who claim to care about society's most vulnerable members. What perhaps makes these cases even more unsettling is how they expose the terrifying reality that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. It doesn't always come wrapped in darkness or wearing a mask. Sometimes it sits quietly in a hospital ward, administering medicine to sick children. Sometimes it walks the streets of ordinary Canadian towns, blending seamlessly into the background. Sometimes it crosses international borders, disguised as a man of faith, preying on society's most vulnerable. The psychological profiles of these killers reveal disturbing patterns that challenge our understanding of human nature. Beverly Allitt, for instance, exhibited classic symptoms of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition where individuals create or fabricate illnesses in others to gain attention and sympathy. But what makes her case particularly chilling is how she weaponized her position of trust. Parents brought their sick children to that hospital believing they would receive care and healing. Instead, they encountered a predator who saw their vulnerability as an opportunity. Professor Roy Meadow, the pediatrics expert who testified at Allitt's trial, made a haunting observation that still resonates today. He stated that Beverly Allitt would never be cured, making her a clear and permanent danger to anyone she might encounter. This assessment speaks to something deeply disturbing about certain types of killers. They don't kill out of passion or temporary madness. They kill because something fundamental is broken inside them, something that cannot be fixed or rehabilitated. The case of Luis Garavito represents evil on an almost incomprehensible scale. Between 1992 and 1999, he systematically murdered upwards of 400 children across Colombia, making him potentially the most prolific serial killer in recorded history. What makes his story particularly horrifying is not just the numbers, but the calculated nature of his crimes. Garavito didn't kill in frenzied attacks or moments of uncontrolled rage. He developed a methodical system for identifying, luring, and destroying lives. His victims were chosen specifically because they were society's forgotten children: street kids, orphans, the homeless, and abandoned, children who wouldn't be missed quickly, if at all. He would approach them dressed as a priest or monk, offering candy, money, or work. The religious disguise wasn't accidental. It was a calculated exploitation of trust, using one of society's most sacred symbols to mask unspeakable evil. The geographic scope of Garavito's crimes was staggering. He operated across 54 different Colombian towns, constantly moving to avoid detection. This wasn't the work of a disorganized killer acting on impulse. This was a man who understood how to exploit systemic failures, how to prey on societal neglect, and how to disappear into the shadows before anyone realized what had happened. When Garavito was finally captured and confessed, the details he provided were so extensive and precise that investigators realized they had been dealing with something far beyond their initial understanding. He could describe specific locations, specific children, specific methods of disposal. He had kept mental records of his crimes with the same meticulous attention that others might apply to a business ledger. The legal aftermath of these cases reveals another disturbing reality about how our justice systems struggle to process evil of this magnitude. Colombia's legal system, never designed to handle serial killers of Garavito's scale, could only sentence him to a maximum of roughly 13 years per murder. Even multiplied by the confirmed victim count, the mathematics of justice seemed inadequate when faced with such systematic destruction of life. Similarly, Russell Johnson's case in Canada exposed gaps in mental health intervention that allowed a dangerous predator to operate for years. Despite being diagnosed as a sexual deviant and voluntarily admitting himself to psychiatric care, the system failed to prevent his escalating violence. His victims, including Diane Bites, Donna Veldboom, and others, paid the ultimate price for these systemic failures. Johnson's confession revealed the calculated nature of his crimes. He described having an uncontrollable urge to rape and kill, but his actions demonstrated clear premeditation and planning. The fact that he cleaned Donna Veldboom's body after killing her, tucked her into bed, and washed the bloody linens reveals a disturbing compulsion for control and order, even in the midst of chaos and violence. These cases force us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil and our ability to detect it. How many others like Beverly Allitt have worked in positions of trust, their crimes hidden behind professional credentials and societal respect? How many predators like Garavito have exploited vulnerable populations in societies where certain lives are deemed less valuable? How many Russell Johnsons have slipped through mental health systems that lack the resources or understanding to contain truly dangerous individuals? The international scope of these crimes also highlights how evil can transcend borders and cultures. From the moors of England to the hospitals of Lincolnshire, from the streets of London, Ontario, to the rural villages of Colombia, these killers found ways to exploit universal human vulnerabilities. Trust, desperation, innocence, and societal neglect exist everywhere, and predators have learned to recognize and exploit these weaknesses, regardless of geography or culture. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how these cases demonstrate that some individuals can commit unspeakable acts while maintaining facades of normalcy or even respectability. Gerald Archer worked regular jobs, had relationships, appeared to be just another struggling member of society. Beverly Allitt was a qualified nurse, trusted by colleagues and families alike. Luis Garavito used religious disguises to exploit one of humanity's most fundamental sources of comfort and trust. The ripple effects of their crimes extend far beyond their immediate victims. Families were destroyed, communities were traumatized, and entire professions were forced to confront the possibility that monsters might be hiding among them. The parents who lost children to Beverly Allitt's care didn't just lose their babies, they lost their faith in the systems designed to protect the most vulnerable. The families of Garavito's victims didn't just lose their children, they lost them to a predator who specifically targeted their poverty and desperation. These stories serve as dark reminders that evil often wears ordinary faces and operates in ordinary places. It reminds us that vigilance cannot be reserved only for obvious threats, but must extend to those who seem most trustworthy, most helpful, most willing to offer aid to those in need. When you dig deeper into the psychological profiles of these killers, a disturbing pattern emerges that goes far beyond their individual acts of violence. What becomes truly terrifying isn't just what they did, but how they managed to operate for so long without detection, and more importantly, how they manipulated the very systems designed to protect society. Take Beverly Allitt, for instance. She didn't just randomly decide to become a killer nurse. Her path to those hospital wards was paved with red flags that everyone ignored. During her training, she had an attendance record so poor it should have disqualified her from ever working with patients. She failed nursing examinations repeatedly. Colleagues reported bizarre behavior, including smearing feces on walls. Her personal relationships were marked by manipulation, false claims of pregnancy, and fabricated rape allegations. Yet somehow, this woman was given access to the most vulnerable patients imaginable, newborn infants. The Grantham and Casteven Hospital was so desperately understaffed that they overlooked every warning sign. They gave her a temporary contract despite her history because they needed bodies to fill shifts. This wasn't just negligence, it was systemic failure on a massive scale. And once she was inside, she had complete access to the drugs and equipment she needed to kill. But here's what makes it even more chilling. Allitt's crimes weren't crimes of passion or desperation. They were calculated performances designed to feed her psychological needs. Medical experts believe she suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition where the perpetrator deliberately causes harm to someone under their care to gain attention and sympathy. She would inject infants with insulin or air bubbles, then rush to save them when they went into cardiac arrest. When she succeeded, she was praised as a dedicated nurse. When she failed, she played the role of the devastated caregiver. For 59 days, she turned that children's ward into her personal theater of horror. 13 children were attacked. 4 died. and the medical staff initially didn't even realize they were dealing with a serial killer. They thought they were experiencing an unusual cluster of medical emergencies. It was only after multiple deaths that someone noticed the pattern that Beverly Allitt was the only nurse present for every single incident. The investigation that followed revealed something even more disturbing. Allitt had been preparing for this for years. Her childhood was marked by attention-seeking behavior and mysterious illnesses that doctors could never quite diagnose. She would hurt herself, then bask in the care and concern she received. By the time she reached adulthood, simply injuring herself wasn't enough. She needed bigger stages, more dramatic performances, and ultimately, the power of life and death over others. When she was finally caught, Allitt showed no genuine remorse. Even in court, she continued her performance, claiming illness and attempting to manipulate the proceedings. She was sentenced to 13 life sentences, with the judge noting that she was unlikely ever to be considered safe for release. Today, she remains locked away at Rampton Secure Hospital, still trying to game the system, still applying for transfers to less secure facilities. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Beverly Allitt's case is how it exposed the vulnerability of our most trusted institutions. Hospitals are places we go when we're at our most vulnerable, when we have no choice but to trust the people caring for us. Parents who brought their sick children to that ward had every reason to believe their babies were safe. Instead, they were delivering them directly into the hands of a predator who saw their suffering as entertainment. This pattern of institutional failure runs through all these cases like a dark thread. Gerald Thomas Archer preyed on vulnerable women working alone in hotels and rooming houses. These women were often from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, working multiple jobs just to survive. They were invisible to society, easy targets who wouldn't be missed quickly if they disappeared, and when they did disappear, the investigations were often cursory at best. Archer understood this dynamic perfectly. He didn't target wealthy women in secure buildings with doormen and security cameras. He went after chambermaids and cleaning ladies, women who worked in the shadows of society, servicing the needs of others while remaining largely invisible themselves. When Belva Russell was found dead in her rooming house, when Jane Woolley's body was discovered, when Edith Othier vanished without a trace, the investigations lacked the urgency and resources that might have been devoted to victims from different circumstances. It took decades for advances in DNA technology to finally connect Archer to his crimes, and even then, it was only after his death that the full scope of his violence became clear. His own family members came forward with information suggesting he had confessed to additional murders while drunk. How many women might still be alive if the system had taken these early disappearances more seriously? The case of Russell Johnson reveals another layer of this institutional failure. Johnson had voluntarily admitted himself to London Psychiatric Hospital in 1969 and been diagnosed as a sexual deviant. He told police that he wouldn't have killed if he had received proper medical treatment. This raises haunting questions about how many other potential killers slip through the cracks of mental health systems that are underfunded, understaffed, and overwhelmed. Johnson's crimes were particularly brutal and methodical. He didn't just kill his victims, he arranged their bodies with obsessive precision, cleaning them, tucking them into bed, washing bloody linens. This wasn't the work of someone in the grip of uncontrollable rage. This was someone acting out deeply disturbed fantasies with terrifying attention to detail. When he was finally caught, Johnson didn't just confess to the 3 murders he was charged with. He admitted to 4 additional homicides and 11 non-fatal assaults. The full scope of his violence may never be known, but what is clear is that he operated for years while the system that was supposed to be monitoring him remained oblivious. Today, Johnson remains locked away at a maximum security mental hospital, chemically castrated and heavily medicated. Every year, he applies for more lenient conditions, and every year, the families of his victims must relive their trauma as they fight to keep him contained. It's a reminder that for these families, justice isn't a single moment in a courtroom. It's an ongoing battle that continues decades after the crimes were committed. These cases force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the societies we've built and the systems we trust to protect us. Evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic gestures or obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears a nurse's uniform, carries a hospital identification badge, and speaks softly to worried parents about their sick children. Sometimes it knocks on hotel room doors, offering help to women working alone. Sometimes it walks among us for years, decades even, hiding in plain sight while institutions fail to connect the dots that could save lives. The most terrifying realization is how easily it could happen again. Right now, somewhere, there are warning signs being ignored, red flags being overlooked, and vulnerable people being failed by the very systems designed to protect them. The monsters we fear aren't hiding in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. What makes these cases even more chilling is how they demonstrate the terrifying effectiveness of predators who understand the systems they're exploiting. Luis Garavito didn't just randomly target children. He studied Colombian society and identified its most vulnerable population: street children, orphans, the forgotten kids who lived in the shadows of a country torn apart by violence and poverty. These weren't accidental victims. They were strategically chosen because Garavito knew nobody would come looking for them. The scope of his operation was staggering. Between 1992 and 1999, this one man systematically hunted across 54 different Colombian towns, rotating his disguises, perfecting his methods, and leaving a trail of over 400 murdered children in his wake. He called himself the Beast, and the name wasn't metaphorical, it was accurate. What separates Garavito from other killers we've discussed isn't just the numbers, though those numbers are incomprehensible. It's the calculated nature of his hunting ground. While Beverly Allitt exploited the trust placed in medical professionals, and Russell Johnson used his proximity to victims, Garavito created an entire false identity system. He would dress as a priest to gain trust, pose as a farmer looking for help, impersonate street vendors, even pretend to be a monk. Each disguise was carefully chosen to appeal to desperate children who had learned that survival meant trusting anyone who offered food, work, or safety. His method was psychological torture disguised as kindness. He would approach a child, offer them something they desperately needed, then walk with them for hours, encouraging them to share their stories, building trust and emotional connection. By the time the child realized what was happening, they were miles from anywhere, completely isolated, and facing a monster who had spent hours learning their fears, their hopes, their dreams, only to use that knowledge to torment them before ending their lives. The children he targeted had already been failed by every system meant to protect them. Broken families, absent social services, overwhelming poverty, and a society that treated street children as disposable problems rather than human beings. Garavito understood this societal neglect and weaponized it. He knew these children's disappearances wouldn't trigger immediate investigations, wouldn't mobilize resources, wouldn't even be reported in many cases. When authorities finally connected the murders, they discovered burial sites containing dozens of small bodies, often mutilated beyond recognition, bearing signs of prolonged torture and sexual assault. The physical evidence told stories of unimaginable suffering, children who had endured hours or even days of torment before death finally released them. Crime scenes revealed that Garavito had developed increasingly elaborate rituals around the murders, suggesting that each killing fed his need for greater levels of control and sadism. What's perhaps most disturbing is how close Garavito came to complete impunity. Colombian law at the time had maximum sentences far below what his crimes warranted. Even after confessing to hundreds of murders, the legal system could only sentence him to roughly 22 years due to legal technicalities and cooperation agreements. The law simply hadn't anticipated someone capable of such systematic, large-scale evil. But Garavito's story reveals something darker about how societies create the conditions for monsters to thrive. Colombia in the 1990s was a country where thousands of children lived on the streets, where poverty made families abandon children they couldn't feed, where violence was so common that missing children barely registered as tragedies. Garavito didn't create these conditions. He exploited them with methodical precision. The investigation that finally caught him revealed a pattern of institutional failures spanning years. Police departments in different regions hadn't communicated about similar murders. Social services had no system for tracking missing street children. The justice system treated child murders as lower priority crimes. Garavito moved through these gaps like a predator navigating a maze designed in his favor. Even his childhood, while marked by abuse and trauma, doesn't explain the calculated nature of his crimes. Millions of children suffer abuse without becoming serial killers. What made Garavito different was his decision to transform his pain into a systematic campaign of revenge against the most innocent and vulnerable members of society. He didn't just kill children. He hunted them with the patience and planning of someone who had found his life's purpose in causing maximum suffering. The geographic scope of his crimes created a web of terror across Colombia. Families in dozens of towns lived with the knowledge that their children could vanish without trace. Parents who had lost children to Garavito often never learned what happened, never recovered bodies, never received closure. The psychological trauma extended far beyond his direct victims to encompass entire communities living in fear. When Garavito died of cancer in prison in 2023, he took with him the locations of countless burial sites, the identities of victims whose names were never recorded, and details of crimes that may never be fully understood. His death closed a chapter on one of history's most prolific serial killers, but it didn't provide answers to the families still searching for children who disappeared during his killing spree. These 5 cases, Brady and Hindley, Beverly Allitt, Gerald Archer, Russell Johnson, and Luis Garavito represent different faces of the same fundamental evil: the deliberate choice to cause maximum suffering to the most vulnerable people in society. They remind us that monsters don't announce themselves with obvious warning signs. They blend into ordinary life, exploit trust and institutional weaknesses, and leave behind devastation that echoes through generations of survivors. The most terrifying lesson from studying these killers isn't about their individual pathologies. It's about how easily evil can flourish when societies fail to protect their most vulnerable members. As we reach the end of this journey through the darkest corners of human behavior, we're left confronting an uncomfortable truth about the nature of evil itself. These 5 cases, scattered across decades and continents, reveal patterns that should terrify us, not because they're extraordinary, but because they're so devastatingly ordinary in their execution. Luis Garavito didn't announce his intentions with dramatic flair. He didn't wear a mask or leave cryptic messages. He simply approached vulnerable children with candy and promises of work, exploiting their desperation with the calculated precision of a predator who understood exactly how society's failures had created his hunting ground. Over 7 years, he murdered at least 400 children, maybe more, and the most chilling aspect isn't the scale of his crimes, but how easily he moved through communities without raising suspicion. Think about that for a moment. 400 children, each one with a name, a family, dreams that would never be realized. Garavito targeted the homeless, the neglected, the forgotten, children who roamed the streets of Colombian towns looking for food or safety. He rotated his disguises, often posing as a priest or farmer, someone trustworthy, someone who represented authority and protection. The very symbols of sanctuary became instruments of predation. When he was finally caught in 1999, investigators discovered a geographical span of crimes that defied comprehension. 54 towns across Colombia bore the scars of his presence. Bodies buried in shallow graves, scattered across remote locations, some never found. The families of his victims lived with an agony that transcended grief, not knowing where their children lay, not able to perform the basic human ritual of burial and mourning. But here's what makes Garavito's story particularly haunting. The Colombian legal system, unprepared for the sheer magnitude of his crimes, sentenced him to roughly 22 years in prison after he cooperated with authorities to locate victims' bodies. 22 years for 400 murders. The law simply had no framework for processing such systematic evil. It was a legal system designed for individual crimes, not industrial-scale slaughter. Garavito died in prison in 2023, taking with him the locations of bodies that were never recovered and the details of crimes that were never fully cataloged. His death closed a chapter, but didn't answer the fundamental questions his life raised about how society creates the conditions for such predators to flourish. What connects all 5 of these killers, what makes their stories so deeply disturbing, isn't their individual pathologies, but the systems that enabled them. Beverly Allitt walked the halls of a hospital for months, systematically attacking children under her care, while medical staff initially attributed the unusual number of cardiac arrests to coincidence. Gerald Archer preyed on chambermaids, women working alone in hotels and boarding houses, knowing their isolation made them perfect victims and their social status made their deaths less likely to generate intensive investigation. Russell Johnson, the bedroom strangler, lived in the same apartment building as one of his victims, attended the same social circles, moved through the same communities. His neighbors described him as quiet, unremarkable. The mundane nature of his existence provided perfect camouflage for his nocturnal predations. Even today, locked in a maximum security mental hospital, taking medication to chemically reduce his violent impulses, he continues to apply for more lenient conditions, demonstrating that the hunger for freedom and opportunity remains alive in even the most controlled circumstances. The Moore's murderers, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, operated as a couple, their relationship providing both emotional support and practical assistance for their crimes. They didn't fit the stereotype of isolated, antisocial killers. They had jobs, maintained relationships, appeared normal to their neighbors and colleagues. Brady's intellectual pretensions, his fascination with philosophy and literature, his ability to articulate complex ideas, made him seem sophisticated rather than dangerous. Hindley's role as his devoted partner confused investigators and the public, who struggled to understand how a woman could participate in such horrific crimes against children. But that's exactly the point. These weren't monsters in the way we like to imagine monsters. They were people who made choices, day after day, to prioritize their own twisted desires over the lives and safety of others. They were capable of functioning in society, of maintaining relationships, of appearing normal, even charming. Their evil wasn't the result of obvious mental illness or dramatic psychological breaks. It was the product of calculated decisions to view other human beings as objects to be used and discarded. The most disturbing aspect of studying these cases isn't the graphic details of their crimes, though those are certainly horrific. It's the realization of how easily evil can hide behind facades of normalcy, how institutions designed to protect the vulnerable can become hunting grounds for predators, and how society's tendency to trust authority figures and dismiss the concerns of marginalized populations creates opportunities for systematic abuse. Beverly Allitt wore a nurse's uniform, a symbol of healing and care. Parents brought their sick children to the hospital, believing they were seeking salvation, only to deliver them into the hands of someone who saw their suffering as entertainment. The trust placed in medical institutions, the vulnerability of sick children, the chaos of an understaffed ward, all combined to create perfect conditions for a predator to operate with impunity. Gerald Archer understood that chambermaids, often middle-aged women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, working alone during quiet shifts, would be easy targets whose disappearances might not immediately raise alarms. He exploited not just their physical vulnerability, but their social invisibility. These were women working honest jobs to support themselves and their families, and their dedication to their work made them predictable, routine, accessible to someone who took the time to study their patterns. The geographic spread of these crimes reveals another disturbing pattern. Garavito moved freely across Colombian towns, thus Brady and Hindley operated across different locations around Manchester. Gerald Archer's crimes spanned multiple jurisdictions. The lack of communication between different police departments, the absence of centralized databases, the tendency to treat crimes as isolated incidents rather than parts of larger patterns, all contributed to these killers' ability to operate for extended periods. But perhaps the most chilling realization is how these stories force us to confront the fragility of the systems we depend on for protection. We trust that hospitals will heal our children, that hotels will provide safe accommodations for travelers, that neighborhoods will look out for their residents. These killers succeeded because they understood how to exploit the gaps in these systems, how to identify vulnerabilities, and manipulate trust. The randomness of their victim selection adds another layer of horror. Most of these killers didn't target people they knew personally or had grudges against. They selected victims based on availability, vulnerability, and opportunity. Children walking home from school, women working alone, homeless individuals seeking shelter, patients recovering in hospital beds. The arbitrary nature of their selection means that any of us, under the right circumstances, could have found ourselves in their crosshairs. What makes these cases particularly relevant today is how they illuminate the ongoing challenges we face in protecting vulnerable populations. The same social conditions that enabled these killers continue to exist. Children still go missing from marginalized communities without generating significant media attention. Healthcare workers still operate with insufficient oversight in understaffed facilities. Travelers still find themselves alone in unfamiliar places, dependent on the goodwill of strangers. The technology that helps us solve crimes today, DNA analysis, digital surveillance, improved communication between law enforcement agencies, might have caught these killers sooner. But technology alone isn't enough. It requires human judgment, institutional commitment, and social awareness to recognize patterns and respond appropriately. The stories of these 5 killers serve as a reminder that evil rarely announces itself with dramatic flourishes. It typically arrives quietly, wearing familiar faces, speaking in reassuring tones, offering help or comfort or opportunity. It exploits our natural tendency to trust, our reluctance to believe that people we know or institutions we depend on could harbor such darkness. But these stories also reveal something important about human resilience and the power of investigation and justice, even when delayed. Gerald Archer's crimes were solved decades after his death through advances in DNA technology and the courage of family members who came forward with information. Beverly Allitt's pattern of attacks was eventually recognized by medical staff who had the courage to question unusual patterns and call for investigation. The families of victims in all these cases showed remarkable strength in pursuing justice, keeping their loved ones' memories alive, and working to prevent similar tragedies. They transformed their grief into advocacy, their loss into a determination to protect others from similar fates. As we close this examination of some of history's most disturbing criminals, we're left with uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil, the reliability of the systems we trust, and our own ability to recognize danger when it presents itself in familiar forms. These weren't stories from some distant time or foreign place. They happened in our communities, our institutions, our neighborhoods. The real horror isn't that such people exist, though that's certainly terrifying. The real horror is how easily they blend into the fabric of ordinary life, how naturally they exploit the trust and vulnerability that make human society possible. They remind us that vigilance isn't paranoia, that questioning authority isn't disrespect, and that protecting the vulnerable requires constant attention and institutional commitment. These 5 killers, operating across different decades and continents, targeting different populations and using different methods, all succeeded for the same fundamental reason. They understood that evil thrives in the spaces between our assumptions about safety and the reality of human nature. They exploited the gap between how we think the world works and how it actually operates. The children who trusted Luis Garavito's promises of candy and work, the patients who relied on Beverly Allitt's medical care, the women who felt safe in their workplace routines, the families who believed their neighborhoods were secure, all fell victim to predators who understood exactly how to weaponize trust and exploit vulnerability. Their stories serve as both warning and tribute, warning about the dangers that hide behind familiar faces and trusted institutions, tribute to the victims whose lives were cut short and the families who refused to let their memories fade into obscurity, and perhaps most importantly, they serve as a call to action, reminding us that protecting the innocent requires more than good intentions. It requires vigilance, accountability, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths about the capacity for evil that exists within seemingly ordinary people and institutions. The most evil serial killers you've never heard of succeeded not because they were criminal masterminds or supernatural monsters, but because they understood something fundamental about human nature and social systems that the rest of us prefer not to acknowledge. They understood that trust, vulnerability, and the desire for normalcy create opportunities for those willing to exploit them without conscience or remorse. Their legacy isn't just the lives they destroyed, though that toll is immeasurable. Their legacy is the lesson they teach us about the price of complacency and the necessity of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. In the end, they remind us that the line between civilization and chaos is thinner than we like to believe, and that maintaining that line requires constant vigilance from all of us.